The agenda this week examined cybersecurity risks in the province and asked if artificial intelligence is as smart as it appears. The agenda's week in review begins assessing whether governments should jump into the business of building much-needed rental housing.
Ontario rental housing starts. Let's just look at the last 30 plus years, shall we? Got a lot done. Rental construction starts got a lot done in the early 1990s. For those of you listening on podcast, we'll just say that it was going gangbusters in the early 1990s. Then the recession hit, and this number, the graph just takes, it's like a ski slope. It just goes straight down. It sort of inches its way back up through the early part of the 21st century. And as we get to the year 2021, the ski slope is actually starting to come back up. So I guess we need to ask here, Carolyn, what happened in the early 1990s that sent the number down, and what's bringing it back up?
Well, I think it was the worst of all possible worlds, and I think Tony will have a certain amount to say about this when he gets his turn. So partly it was a recession, partly it was construction costs and interest costs going up, partly it was a change in government regulations to support home ownership at the expense of rental housing construction, and part of it was simply that condos had come along. They'd come along in the 70s. They'd become legalized, but they suddenly became a much better penciling out factor than rental construction. So it was sort
What's
of
a penciling out factor mean?
Well, I mean, it was just better for developers in terms of profit to get a profit through selling condos as opposed to retaining and renting out apartments.
Okay.
So the thing about housing policy that we need to start with is there is no magic bullet. It's always a confluence of factors that need to be looked at at all three levels of government.
I think she said Tony may have something to say about this because you worked for the Mike Harris government at the time. And if you look at the late 1990s, the numbers are pretty low.
They are.
How come?
Yeah, I think obviously most of the main points, or virtually all of the main points, were hit by Carolyn. And so I guess I would just expand on, certainly as with respect to condominiums, it's true that the economics of condominiums are different than rental. Obviously, they have to pencil out. And certainly that became something that was much more economically feasible to be able to get the capital into building those kinds of projects. That said, we fast forward in the periods after that, and we know the rental was not getting built at the extent that we needed to, except for the last couple of years. We did start to see, I think the chart showed, the numbers starting to trend in the right direction again, but nowhere near what we need. And so the conversation really needs to be about how much housing do we need, what kind of housing do we need, and who needs to play what role in supporting make that happen.
All good questions we're going to get to. Brad, let me bring you in on this sort of deeply philosophical question here, which is to say, the numbers have been fairly low for about the last 20 years or so, inching up lately, as we've said. Does this reflect, in your view, and I ask you this as a former planner, you used to work in the planning department at the city before you got elected, does this reflect a failure of the market to create enough housing that we need in cities and towns all over the province?
Well, it is a complicated issue, and I think there's a lot of dynamics at play. First and foremost, policy at the federal and provincial levels that have incentivized the construction of rental, those disappeared, and we just saw that on the graph, and that really changed the investment profile and the decisions for people to park their time and their energy and their capital into these projects. So we moved away from rental. There's been a lot of challenges at local government. We have to have some humility around that. Our involvement in whether we are helping to facilitate the construction of new housing, whether that's rental or condominium, we certainly, historically have been obstructionists in that. There's a very strong NIMBY culture here in Toronto post-amalgamation. That's changing. I think we're at a tipping point because we're recognizing the breadth of the crisis that we're dealing with. And, on a go-forward basis, the City of Toronto will continue to be a magnet for talent, for immigration, for folks who want to come here. And if you want to come and live in the City of Toronto, I want you to live here. But first and foremost, we need to make sure that there's an opportunity for folks to have an affordable option to live. And right now, with respect to rental, we're dealing with less than 1% rental vacancy in the Toronto market. And so rents, supply and demand, rents are going up. Availability is going down. We're facing headwinds with rising interest rates. So folks who perhaps were looking to get into home ownership are not necessarily able to do that right now because of the cost of capital and financing challenges. And so all of that makes it, much more stress and strain on the rental market in Toronto, and we don't have enough.
They're looking for opportunities to make money and create the maximum amount of incentive for the organization to pay the money so they can get back to business. And so, they are entrepreneurs and they are business people trying to make money, and they'll go after anything.
Can you tell us how this works? If you wanted to attack a hospital, how do you do it?
Sure. Well, I think one fundamental difference from today's fraudster, the cyber criminal, and yesterday's, which plays into the question you're asking, is they don't live in our community, right? They don't have to look anyone in the eye and say, hey, I'm attacking an institution that keeps children healthy or tries to bring them back to health. What's happening here is most of these attacks are emanating from abroad, often in countries that don't have extradition treaties or any sort of normalized relations with countries in the West, like Canada, the United States, the UK. So, I think people assume to be a cyber criminal today, you have to be a technical savant. And the reality is you and I can go on the internet right now and find very simple attacks and play a volume game to see who will fall for my trap, for my phishing scheme, for my ransomware. And the challenge here is the most vulnerable in society, that small and medium enterprise, senior citizens, immigrants, and institutions like hospitals and education and institutions who don't have expensive cybersecurity solutions today are the ones falling victim. These attacks are on all of us. Those who are falling victim are those who are the most vulnerable in our society.
But Tracy, it feels different now. I understand going after vulnerable senior citizens who are not sophisticated perhaps in these ways. That's been happening for a long time. Going after energy installations, nuclear power plants, is this different now? It feels like it.
It is different, and I think part of that comes from our society and the world is different. So the way we operate, everything's interconnected. Everything's using technology to run our systems. So our world's different, and what threat actors are doing then, or cyber criminals are doing, is different, and we're feeling and seeing that difference. And I really look at, we have a very interconnected ecosystem of what people do, the technology we use, and our processes. And so our approaches have to really tackle all different fronts, not just the technology, but how we behave and act in our world today.
How vulnerable do you think our major institutions are right now?
I think they're very vulnerable. I think they're vulnerable because investments, need to be made. There's been good investments. There's been good movement by governments at all levels. There's been good movement by public and private sector organizations, but much more clearly needs to be done. The international cybersecurity threat environment is extremely serious. Building on Neil's point, the fact is that these ransomware attackers are attacking from jurisdictions like Russia, like Iran, like North Korea. And Canadian institutions like SickKids Hospital are at the front lines of an international global cyber conflict that is happening. And we have to look at it that way. And we have to invest meaningfully and purposefully with that broader view in mind.
Are we at war, Charles?
War is a complicated,
but it's cyber war.
Word. It certainly is. Listen, it is certainly a very dangerous dynamic that puts our most vulnerable populations at risk, and we need to take a focused, all of economy, all of society approach to this extremely challenging dynamic.
Going to pick up on that in a second. First of all, Sheldon, let's go to the bottom of page 1 here. We've got a 2021 cyber threat bulletin from the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity, and here's what they found. In the first half of 2021, global ransomware attacks increased by 151% when compared with the first half of 2020. In Canada, the estimated average cost of a data breach, a compromise that includes but is not limited to ransomware, is 6.35 million Canadian dollars. The Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity has knowledge of 235 ransomware incidents against Canadian victims from the 1st of January to the 16th of November 2021. More than half of these victims were critical infrastructure providers. It's important to note, however, that most ransomware events remain unreported. How come, Neil?
I think there's a number of reasons why organizations, individuals aren't reporting. In the enterprise space, there's a reputational risk piece. There are insurance considerations. We're seeing the largest insurance providers now challenging claims, some getting out of the business wholly. I think there is, at the individual level, we're seeing seniors not wanting to lose their independence from their family, and being taken for a fraud often puts fear into them. There's a number of reasons, but I think the most important thing that you highlight in that bulletin is the unreported side. We think we have a handle on this issue, and not just for concerted efforts not to report. I think there's so many more that just are unknown. You know, the amount of things I look at in my inbox every morning that I just kind of dismiss as phishing. If someone was knocking on my door to commit a similar type of fraud, my likelihood to call my local police is much higher than it is for all those phishing schemes. We do not have a true societal understanding of the magnitude of this challenge.
A simple Google search will often produce links to misinformation. How is AI tech like ChatGPT different from that?
Well, one thing, just seeing the quote that you made, is Chat wants to throw the humans under the bus. But the reality is that Chat doesn't always behave in ways that are consistent with the data that's there. So, for example, if you ask it for the average height of the female presidents of the United States, it will just invent female presidents of the United States that don't exist. I've seen systems like this, for example, say that Elon Musk died in a car accident in 2018. And what's interesting about that is that there's a lot of data that are out there that show you that Elon Musk is still alive. So yes, some of the misinformation it creates, for example, about COVID vaccines, is from human beings that have said things that are untrue, and it will simply blindly repeat them. But it also doesn't know how different pieces of things go together. And so sometimes it fabricates things that no human has ever seen before. There's, in fact, lots of examples on my Twitter feed of it doing that. So it actually creates a new misinformation problem beyond the one that's already there. And then it creates a third one, which is that it's so good at creating misinformation that, for example, a Russian troll farm might want to buy itself a copy of GPT-3, which is not, or a knockoff of GPT-3, which is not that expensive, and then use it to accelerate the production of misinformation. So it spreads existing misinformation, it fabricates new stuff, and accelerates the pace. So that's three things to be pretty worried about there. Jillian is right that there are positives too, but I don't think we can take for granted that the positives are going to outweigh the negatives. There's some pretty serious negatives there.
Well, in fact, you've gone further in writing. You've said that systems like these pose a real and imminent threat to the fabric of society. You really want to go that far?
I really do want to go that far. The reason is there's the Russian fire hose model of misinformation, which is you just spread so much misinformation that nobody trusts anything anymore. It's not that you want to get across one specific thing, but you just want to create an atmosphere of distrust. And I think that this tool, like the flood the zone with, I guess I can't say the word on the air, that Steve Bannon talked about, this is a tool that can create an atmosphere of radical mistrust. And historically, I think it's authoritarians that have preyed on that atmosphere, and I'm worried about that.
Allison, how worried are you that this new technology is going to push us further into a so-called post-truth era?
Well, there's an interesting historical analogy. So if you think about when cheap forms of print first appeared in the 18th century, two things happened. One thing that happened was that you could quickly spread messages like democracy and the Enlightenment, and it's no coincidence that Benjamin Franklin was a printer. But another thing that happened that we don't think about very often was that there was exactly the kind of flood of obscenity and libel and misinformation that Gary is talking about. And it was a contributing factor in the French Revolution, for example. So we've sort of seen this before. And the interesting thing is that what seems to have happened is that we developed new kinds of regulation, new norms, new laws, new institutions like editors and newspapers that actually meant that this there's a wonderful book by Richard Darton called The Literary Underground of the Ancien Regime, where he just described this incredible flood of the word that Gary was about to use. I mean, for example, Let Them Eat Cake, Marie Antoinette's Let Them Eat Cake, that was a meme, a misinformation meme from the 18th century. So it's not like this kind of thing hasn't happened before. And we have a hint from that the way to solve it is to have norms and regulations and ways of and institutions that are designed to make sure that we don't have that kind of flood. I'm not convinced that this is the capacity for humans to get misinformation from the culture is something that is now qualitatively different from what we've done before, but the way that we've dealt with it before is the way that we need to deal with it now. Jillian used the example of electricity, and that's another interesting metaphor, right? So if you sort of imagine it's 1900 and someone says, here's a good idea, every house is going to have this extremely strong electrical spark in it, which we know sets things on fire, but we're just going to put it in everybody's house and assume that everything will work out fine in the end. Well, it only works out fine when you have, a book of code that's this thick about what you have to do to keep electricity in check. And I think that's an analogy to what will happen with these kinds of systems.
That's just some of what we've covered this week. You can find more, including the full conversations, on our website, tvo.org, our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda, or our Twitter feed, twitter.com/theagenda.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.